Hello and welcome to Hyper Live. And today's episode, we have our special guest, Col Perks, who I've worked with for many years, a very, very experienced architect of very many different systems. So looking forward to the conversation today. And today's topic is the IT fossil record has many layers. Is AI bedrock or just sediment? And we'll be
I don't know who
exploring
came
that.
up with that, but it's a great title. It's a great title.
It's a great topic. And we'll explore that from a sort of architectural lens. But
We
Col,
should
do you
start
want
with
to
that, actually. Yeah, hi, I'm Cole. I've been in the industry for many years. Since the 80s, I guess. So that, I don't know. Is that mainframes? Who knows? Right through to wherever the hell we are now, which is basically things in the cloud. Mostly in architecture space. So sometimes enterprise architecture, other times system architecture is like, whatever needs to be done, depending on the country you're in, because the jurisdiction always has a different view about how big or small things need to be and how big or small the teams are. I've worked in big, massive teams, 900 people, and then right now I'm working in a little startup where there's only 2 people.
Yeah, cool. And before we start digging into some trends and what we're seeing, Daniel, co-host.
Hey, yeah, good to be chatting with you, Gareth and Cole. We've had the opportunity to work together a little bit, all three of us. And we always had a good yarn. So I'm sure today will be no different.
If you think back over, the last sort of 10, 15 years in particular, like what's changed from an architecture perspective? Because I know you're a little bit tentative about the use of the role or the value of the role enterprise architecture, but what's changed to make you change your opinion about that?
I guess, like, if you think about the sort of, it depends on your sort of background, but if you think about in architecture terms, think about the 90s, right? That's what I would call like the big framework eras. So if you think about that, like that 10 years or maybe even longer, actually, when was Zachman? 60s, 70s, something like that.
Yeah.
So right up to the 90s, there was there was huge investments in like frameworks, developing frameworks like TOGAF, and I mean even before TOGAF there was XOpen. There's so many things going on, hundreds of these things, and in fact, as an architect, that's what you had to know. It was almost like the instrumental rationality of being an architect. If you weren't certified in X, then you weren't an architect, essentially. And organizations sort of like had that kind of idea that essentially, it's like the quality standards way back then for agile kicked in, was the fact that if you had one, then it must generate quality. So that was the thing. And I guess over the last 20 years, probably, in fact, I'd say right up to, there was a group of us reflecting on this just the other day, was like, do we even talk frameworks anymore? Does anyone even know these frameworks? That these things, they're still around, but I think we've now entered in sort of like either an anti-methodological era or the end of frameworks entirely. So and I think there's fundamentally there's so many reasons for that, but I think one of the significant reasons is like EA is kind of a failed idea. It worked in the 90s, but it doesn't work anymore, just simply because of that big system thinking that we saw. Like if you're going to build a rocket, you probably needed a 100-person enterprise architecture team. But these days you can build software incredibly quickly, and you can make a mess of things really quickly, as opposed to the old days where you can make a mess of things over a long period of time, and it would cost you a lot. So yeah, I think that's the fundamental change. I think we're now in a mode where it's kind of like the Roman Empire. Come about the 6th century, the Romans still thought there was an empire, but it had gone. It just because no one cared anymore. They were doing Christianity or whatever, whatever Byzantium was doing. So it's just, and I think we're in that mode that the sort of like the massive constructs of EA or the sort of big architecture disciplines, the big methods, are now moved into the big organizations that are actually just protecting their product.
I feel like the frameworks are still there, but It's more like you go and do an archaeological dig through them and
Yeah.
grab out sort of, meaty sets of concepts. So they're handy as a resource, but I would never say take all of this.
Oh, barely. And I think even the 90s, no one ever did that. I mean, like if you take the early days of TOGAF, like that had, it was like 800 pages or something you had to read, and that was they even, and of course, so the way TOGAF evolved, Open Group evolved TOGAF, was they go, okay, well, that's been kind of successful, everyone's certified, now let's take over the business, we'll call this thing business architecture as well, so now we'll do everything, and so I think the current version, or the coming 2010s, that was like thousands of pages, and it requires a course of but no one ever did that, right? You always took bits and pieces, and everyone kind of carried around a kind of a methodological kit bag, if you like.
I think even PEEF is probably 800 pages now. Like, the one that was supposed to be
that's
simpler.
that's just TOGAF with some of the words changed,
and of course they've all
team built it.
Yeah, and they've all sort of changed as well. Like the latest version of TOGAF, I think it's a couple of years old now, version 10, and it's got it references sort of agile thinking and a bit more iterative and incremental kind of approach to things. But as with frameworks, they have their sort of their moments, and then you have to keep bolting on bits onto the side to keep them relevant and fresh. But I think there's maybe another shift in there, which was the idea that maybe back in the 90s we could use reductionist thinking to break things down and to build things, and now distributed systems, emergent properties, and the kind of complex adaptive systems thinking like that really, it changes the way you have to think about building things, right? You can't do everything up front. You've got to respond to design as it emerges as well, right?
Yeah, I think if you think about the sort of like that, the rhetoric that or the discourse around architecture today, which is this emergent, the evolutionary, emergent style of architecture, it wasn't even possible, and I guess when you were buying servers, and implementing big software, but and so it's certainly had its time, but like even in the early days, I'm trying to think of the guy, Roger Sessions, maybe from the 90s. There was a huge polemic critique of EA right even then. Like it's too complex. It's so it's some of those sort of early papers. Like it's like those. There was this ecological shift in about the early 2000s. Like the Dynamo paper came out, and 2000 whatever, and he was publishing, and all of a sudden there was this kind of moment where you go, oh, agile obviously was becoming a significant thing, even though it had been around forever or a long time. And then all of a sudden there was this, like, it's reaching sort of like us sort of practitioner architect level, thinking, oh my God, these things could be broken, and so really you had two choices: either get out of Dodge or find a grey suit and sit in the corner for the next 20 years.
There's something about the role of feedback loops. So I mean, you mentioned Agile, you mentioned the Dynamo paper, and the nature of the businesses that were starting to lead in terms of building software, and I think a common theme around there is almost this ability to sort of validate things as you were going. And so all of that rigor and detail in the frameworks was almost being actively disproven by the fact that people could get there faster by putting something out there, either in a small or a larger way, and then put it into reality. And then, and I think there's an interesting connection there with AI, which I'm sure we'll be talking about at some point in today's episode, about its role in feedback loops.
And I think if one of the significant characteristics of those sort of big frameworks is how artifact heavy they are. So what's the kind of common critique? It's like basically RUP, rational unified process, 185 artifacts or something like that. And that's not even enterprise architecture. That's just software or system architecture. And then down to Kanban, there's like one practice or something, or two practices. So those, and that sort of artifact, and that artifact heavy world is still around. Like I say, the Roman Empire is not over yet. It's it just doesn't, well, it probably is over, it just doesn't realize it. So,
Is there anything? Is there anything from those frameworks that you've kept or that has influenced you?
Yeah, totally. So like it's really interesting, right? Like that ability to concern separate, for instance, it's like it's and I'm just trying to work out whether that was in frameworks. So we used this thing years ago on the I was working on the NHS National Health Program, which was this massive program in the UK. I mean, it was billions, and I mean, this is sort of pre-cloud. Maybe S3 was around. I don't know when S3 turned up. The and we adopted this approach called RUP SE. So it's a rational unified process, which with all its artifacts for systems engineering. And one of the most significant things, I think I still have the picture actually, and it described the kind of flow down process of how you concern separate and how you test concern separations. So it was kind of like early evolutionary architecture, if you like. So it's like don't go and and the idea of actually, because one of the things like over the years is one of those things you sort of spot. Whilst there's lots of artifacts in this practice of architecture, you do find that there's a bunch of disciplines that have just atrophied. So, for instance, like having a business picture, a rich picture with a cylinder on it, with it's saying that this is my database. So like the things that we got, I guess, taught was like your viewpoints are critical. So if you remember, like there was even an ISO standard, was it ISO 1741, 1471, which is basically how to describe architectures. So there was an architecture description standard, which talked about viewpoints and perspectives. And so those things, like you don't need, again, you don't need those texts, but having that as a little practice going, should I be putting a database cylinder on this picture that contains my customer's geographic locations or whatever, or AWS icons.
There you go. So RUP's still being taught in university in 2005.
No, that makes sense because we were doing RUP in 2003 through to 2003.
It was through RUP that was my entry point into agile, because Rational put out a pamphlet called Rational Iterative Process. It was a much more consumable pamphlet.
Which is what it is.
It was basically 30 pages that much simpler.
And
to be honest, it was like because we were building a portal at the time. I was like, all the previous stuff didn't make any sense in that context where we could be pushing up new pages and content, to be viewed by millions of Australians. And then we saw the iterative process. Now it didn't have all of the concepts of agile, but it certainly got us started on that path. We're like, this makes a lot more sense. And we were pushing stuff out like every day or two, basically.
Yeah, I mean the craziness of RUP is if you follow the kind of the artifact-centered view, it would be almost impossible to generate all the artifacts required in an iteration, which was only 4 weeks. So it's so yeah, it was very weird. But there's some like we're still using sequence diagrams, to describe things. I mean, I know that's not RUP, but of course it has its genesis in the sort of like the early OO sort of like Jacobson and co. But so and they're still good techniques, because again you can visualize your concern separations. Actually, it's really interesting because like the tools have it's really along with kind of like, if you remember the RUP days, there were massive tools, rational rows or whatever that cost you like $1 billion a license or whatever, and you had to have repository teams. When we were working at the NHS, we had 10 people who were managing a model, which using ClearCase and these sort of things. It was extraordinarily difficult just to manage versioning a model. And where are we now? Well, we're using Plant UML in a text editor, which is fantastic.
Yeah. And in fact, I think this is one of the places where I'm finding LLMs incredibly useful, generating a transcript of a conversation with a group and then generating Mermaid or PUML diagrams that represent the conversation or the model, or transcribing documentation from one form to another, or actually creating documentation when it's missing. It's incredibly powerful in that sense.
Yeah. So one of the, I mean, one technique I think is still viable. Like I still think of all the texts from from so long ago, the Eric Evans text is still, it's almost like it's never going to die.
Was that intentional or a bit of luck in there as well? Because I think, I'm
totally.
It's a brilliant piece of work. I remember seeing when I was working at BBC Worldwide, Eric Evans came in. We had this amazing opportunity. Actually, every couple of weeks we'd have someone coming in to talk to the folks at BBC Worldwide. It would be Eric Evans one week, and then Martin Fowler the next, and Craig Lama the next.
Wow.
It was brilliant. But I remember when he did the talk, it was it made so much sense the way he would describe things. It's almost like a moment of clarity when you hear him. But why has it survived so well, do you think?
Because I think it's we had that era of microservices, so I guess we're now in the kind of like the plateau of productivity stage for microservices. We just do everything's distributed, and so his strategic patterns that described like the published language pattern, these ways of looking at an architecture and overlaying a team topology is I think was so contemporary. When did he write that book? 2002. I mean, it's extraordinary. 2003, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
So it's pre-cloud. We were arguing about XML versus binary formats on the wire back then, or Windows versus IBM OS2 or something. Who knows?
I think a lot of people, when you figured out how to organize code with those kind of patterns, then you realize when you're organizing services, you were just looking at it from a higher vantage point, right? But the patterns were very similar.
Yeah, totally. The technical patterns are probably aged, but certainly the strategic thinking is still. I mean, like for instance, like even today, we're going through some energy retailer documentation, and we're trying to sort of like describe what a concern separated distributed system would look like, to deal with this thing, and the noun analysis. So we just ran this through Claude, right? So just basically took the paper and ran through Claude, and it's like, give me all the nouns, give me all the nouns that occur more than once, or whatever, and all of a sudden, like, because naming things is hard. And you kind of realize one thing I did disagree. Sorry, as an aside, you kind of like Eric Evans said, this idea is the business always knows. I'm not sure that's the case, because you always get misled by the business in many respects. But anyway, that's another conversation.
I think that's actually still a fallacy that some architects do believe in. It's just not true. Like, if you ask people to describe, you're trying to imagine a new system to build, and you ask people to describe it, they will describe the current system, and it's just completely counter to product management thinking, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we've always looked at, isn't it? Which is basically we're now in an era where even the leaders who are about to retire in organizations have never been outside an IT world, so they've never had to sit out, be outside of it and have IT introduced to them. They've always been affected by the systems that were produced, and therefore you can't think outside those metaphors. So it's really interesting. It's really interesting. So, big packages or whatever, you have a certain way of, it's amazing how some of these terms are not terms from the business that IT have taken over. It's the opposite.
Everyone is, in a way, optimizing for their own convenience. So it's sort of it's a handy idea that, maybe the arbiter of this decision is someone in the business over there. Because then that's one less thing that I need to be responsible with in my job. So I think that's why that behavior comes about, and we're all prone to it, and they've, because it's basically it's a cognitive bias, right? So we need to be aware of it and know that.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite philosophers is a guy called Michel Foucault. He's dead now, but he's a post-structuralist, and so his concept was like what he called reflexivity. The self, like he was dubious of the self in the first place, but it was like you can't get out of the structures that you're made in, except that you can through some breakdown. So not mental breakdown, but some breakdown case, where things just stop working, or you're able to reflect, or in this case, reflexivity is that ability to have that breakdown plus reflect, and it's it's not rational thinking. It needs something else to see outside the thing.
Yep.
So
that certainly
structure.
rings true in terms of change in organizations, right? You think of everything's so interconnected that products, process, technology, people, the socio-technical systems, so many interconnections that unless you can break that down in some way or create a smaller system within the bigger system with less connections, then I think it's very hard to change.
And then going back to the framework idea.
Sorry,
I was just saying, going back to the framework idea was that those things became kind of a meta narrative, and so like if you've got 100 people who are all trained in framework X, then saying this is just a silly idea is not going to get you very far.
No, that's right. That's right. And so, what about?
They can point to it. They can point to it and say, "Oh, it's the framework's responsible. I didn't need to be responsible."
Or the good old argument of, you just did the framework wrong. You've implemented.
Yeah, that's that kind of instrumental rationality idea. Like we forgot we created it in the first place, and therefore we can change it. It's now the thing that we blame.
You just didn't believe in the framework hard enough. That's why the magic.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, indeed. There's a history of that in our in the Western culture, I believe.
Yes. And so tell us a bit about, I know you will certainly have been a proponent of data mesh, which is, I guess, an evolution of kind of some of these ideas. And also, what we're seeing now, the rise potentially of semantic meaning and schemas. What are your thoughts on data mesh?
Oh my God, there's so much going on here, isn't there? I mean, like it's really, I mean, it's only a few years ago that I sort of I kept out of analytics since the early days of my career, and it's like, except for passing, smelling a burning data warehouse, that sort of back in the 90s and early 2000s, is that where all the money's going? The it was like I read, we were doing a bit of work where we had to sort of take the sort of operational world and apply it to analytical world. And it was like, well, what's the state of the art now? And it just happened that Jean-Marc Degani actually had published some of her papers. So she's the kind of like the originator, or not her and Neil Ford, I guess, the originator of the data mesh idea. And like I had, of course, she had passing views of things like data lakes and blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff. But I never really had a lot of experience. And then when I read her papers, now she comes from that microservices, agile. Background, ThoughtWorks, whatever, and so therefore she was applying. This is a perfect example of someone being reflexive. She was applying a massive critique on a domain she didn't even understand. She had a technology space she wasn't really that familiar with, and it seemed to make entire sense. So if you think about we probably all know what data mesh is these days, because fundamentally everyone's been talking about it for like the last 6 years. Or now AI is everywhere, so fundamentally what resonated with me was this idea, after building microservices and service-based architecture for years, was that why are we extracting data from a database and sticking it in an analytical platform and hoping we're going to get meaning out of it? Why are we doing that? And it's like. And of course, that was one of those things. Well, of course we have to do that. That's how you do it. That's the technique to generate analytics. And of course, you put your microservices or your bounded context hat on, and you go, oh, wait a minute, the database is an implementation detail. It's no wonder this is hard if this is what you're doing. Yeah. So I think whilst a lot of her concepts are very interesting, and probably going to be really hard to implement, considering that we've still got table-based vendors in the cloud. In the analytics space, the data product idea I think is fundamental. Like now that should be the way we're building, on the operational plane. That should be the way we're building our analytical products.
Yeah,
that gets into the analytical tier. So that's the.
I think it's a hugely powerful idea, isn't it? We organize the operational plane of services and using DED ideas because it's easy to understand them. So why not do the same with data products? And why not pick the right technology for a data product? And why not put a boundary around it so it doesn't grow massively and get out of control?
Totally. And like her her very simple diagram was just so like unhappy people along the supply chain of data. That's basically it, except for the operational system people who didn't care because they were just getting someone to extract their data from their database. So it didn't really matter. but actually put the knowledge back to where it is. So that's the first thing. And I think, I mean, we're still in an era of like large corporates who own the analytical space. There's no doubt, and it's still very table centered, because you can think about all the analytical, the typical analytical technologies, mostly a lot of stuff in Python and SQL or whatever. It's still very table based, data frames and tables. But I don't know enough about how RAG and such technologies would actually work in the space. But surely an LLM is going to get better and better, or these vector features or whatever are going to get better and better if there's more semantics. And so the data product idea gives us the opportunity to add semantics, so maybe this is the re-rise of the RDF world. Who knows? I mean, that's
certainly the using schemas of some kind or Turtle and those kind of formats. There's some serious kind of power with that, right? I mean, even if it's just solving the problem of I've got a bunch of domains with bounded context and I need to know that this customer ID means the same as a customer ID over here.
So you've got those two things now in play. You've got the bounded context idea out of domain-driven design, and then you've got this idea of inference from your RDF schemas or whatever, and RDF is not as hard. It was always seen as I always saw it as an academic discipline, something you play with in the academic world. But actually, we've implemented a bunch of JSON-LD, which is like an RDF, an RDF sort of vocab, essentially is on the web everywhere.
That's right.
That's how.
If anybody's seen
that's
right. If you've seen in your email, you've seen the little, your flight with your arrival and destination, the little plane. That's JSON-LD, right?
Yeah, and schema.org and stuff.
Some of the challenge with databases is that the structure is built around speed of access and things like that. So it never caught on, but there was like projects like Apache Drill, which were at least getting away from the approach to normalize the data, which meant that your actual database schema looked much more semantic in the first place. You can obviously take that further in a direction, but it's just like a lot of what we're dealing with just to even interrogate databases is purely there to solve performance issues that we don't have anymore.
Yeah, entirely. And like if you think about the sort of like sort of on that that sliding scale of knowledge, whatever knowledge means, because maybe that's impossible. But like if you think about like a standard relational database, you've got to explicitly define relationships. That's fundamental to the relational database. Like if you take something like an RDF world or OWL or whatever, you can imply relationships. You don't have to assert everything. You can assert transitive things about things.
Yeah,
exactly. And so you don't have to be explicit. You can be explicit about some things, but your schema actually helps you infer knowledge, and that's a step change. And it's not something I don't think is on the immediate horizon. But if you imagine like if LLMs are going to get better at really understanding as opposed to just nearest neighbor or whatever, it's actually that hallucination aspect, then the semantics is going to be important. And we have no technology at the moment to deal with semantics apart from the knowledge graph. And if you look at, I won't pick on anyone, like you take one or two of the big cloud data warehouses in the sky vendors, the knowledge graph idea is in their literature, but it really is you call out to one, because the whole structure is Parquet files. Everything's Parquet files. So that's almost taking away all the knowledge, all the semantics of your data, and flattening it into a set of rows, in one big place. So I think there's a lot to happen. I mean, if graphs became central, to these analytical platforms, then I think we'd have a chance. That would have a chance of taking something, actually getting semantics out of our corporate data.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of interesting, certainly observations from me. There's an organisation we work with called PlanView, and they have a product called Viz. And talking to Mick Kirsten, he's a very smart technologist. They've implemented a knowledge graph, which helps them with their AI inference based sort of querying, and that's a competitive advantage for them. So it's definitely popping up more and more in terms of products now, but not seeing it so much in outside of the product organizations. But there is one other thing I've seen, which I think is now well and truly hitting mainstream, which is natural language querying. And it tends to be table based, but it's really powerful. I mean, you've got to provide some context. There's some pretty sophisticated ways of doing that, and lots of different products that do it in different ways. But just the idea of generative BI, being able to natural language query, then you get a response back. You can get a chart drawn up with whatever technology in the background based on the results. You can iterate on that as a non-technical person, and then you can throw that into your dashboard. That's definitely feels like a shift, right?
Yeah, and I think if you could augment the query with some form of knowledge schema, some form of sort of like implied relationships, like person, client is also billable person, which is also organization, which is also whatever, those sort of things. Then I think that there's a huge power. There's a huge power, and actually, but I guess we're vectors still. We're still in a vector world.
That's right. Yeah, but you can imagine maybe that's the next iteration of instead of text to SQL, it's text to turtle, or
or even that's there's the standard's there, and it's been there forever, and it's everywhere on the web, and so it's not like it's really interesting. I mean, this is not totally AI related, but like it's really fascinating how. So we had a situation where like just units of measure are hard. It's incredible, and so working in, say, the electricity retail space. They've got lots of units of measure, like tons, right? And when you go through systems and look at sort of the analytical spaces or whatever, kilowatt hours is like described 500 different ways, and so big K, small K, whatever, it's like it's something simple and fundamental to the domain is so loosely typed, and so therefore it's whilst it's possible to get knowledge out of that text, you want to know that is a unit of measure, and it's appropriate to apply kilowatts per day or whatever, and so we found an ontology called the units ontology, or QUDT, which is, I think it's a European standards effort, and was starting to look through it, and it was really simple, and it was like oh, I wonder if it's got everything it needs, like KVARH and whatever, and of course it did everything.
Yeah, right.
Everything we needed. So we just moved to sort of like, just adding that as our reference data, for everything. And then you could build graphs from it, which was, it's so powerful without doing any work. Basically someone had done all the work for you. And of course, those URIs actually gave you back a web page that told you what the thing was. So especially you imagine those complex things like KVARH, which are incredibly complex to understand. And from someone who's trying to do billing, and all of a sudden you're using something you directly can just throw in a browser and get a piece of knowledge out of.
That's pretty cool. And so does that help? I'd imagine that helps with standardizing calculations for analytics and various other things, right? Because now, well, at least as a starting point, you know what the unit is. But
exactly.
Yeah,
because if you like the famous JSON sort of API that actually has value : some number, and you go, well, what is it? Is that a currency? Is it a it's one of those. It feels really weird. Whereas it feels really weird that when someone designs a like an API that has no when they know it's kilowatt hours, or they know it's euros, or they know it's whatever cents per day or something like that there hasn't been an attempt to try and define it through a vocab so that you're consistent always. So sorry, my earpods just dropped out. I've got to find it.
That's right. We were we were talking about reflexivity before.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, so we're obviously pretty focused on AI coding. And so thinking about reflexivity in the context of AI coding, it's interesting. You can have, the models are getting smart, but we see the limits pretty quickly. It's like, you throw them at a task and they'll do a bunch of smart stuff until they do something dumb. And so part of the way of reining that in is breaking down the work and asking it to do like something really smart or something just averagely intelligent on something very narrow. And then to look at what the result was. So, what can we observe? Sometimes it gets it right, sometimes it gets it wrong. I think Jeff Huntley describes the phenomena as Ralph Wiggum, referring to the little kid from The Simpsons, where it's just like, yeah, you put him down the slide, and sometimes he'll go down the slide successfully, and sometimes he'll fall on his face. But he'll spring back up, and you can put him back on the slide again. So I think there's something about these loops where both as you, the operator of the AI coding tool, and of the model itself, where it goes, oh, I did something. That bit was silly. Okay, I've got that in my context. Let's do something with it. Is there something there? Like, is there something about what can emerge from these things?
I don't know, Gareth, you use this a lot, right? I mean, are you seeing the ability for these, through this prompt? Well, it doesn't have memory, does it? So, like, how's it learning? How does it learn that, apart from the fact you get annoyed at it?
Well, it builds up context, which I think is, similar to the construct of memory. But look, I mean, my experience is that, I've sort of explained this to a few people. I remember when I first started I was writing a Python program. I wasn't as familiar with Python as I am with some other languages. And I realized that I'm doing exactly the same thing as an engineer. I'm looking at the patterns. I'm sensing when things are getting a little bit on the wrong track, methods too big, or whatever, the structure's getting bloated, or and so you're applying those same thinking process, but I'm just not touching the code anymore. I'm just relying on the LLM to type. So the
including refactoring as you go.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I'm instructing the LLM what to refactor, but it's helping me to do the mechanical part of the refactoring, and it doesn't. It's you're course correcting all of the time. However, it's certainly from my experience way faster. But then I think the thing that's the experience kind of thinking doesn't go away. Like, it's exactly the same for me. That it's just that I'm not typing, right? I'm still thinking the same way, and I'm still having to interact with the code in the same way.
Yeah, I mean that's the interactive mode. So like when we're in sort of chat mode, but in the mode where you're being quite deliberate about some context, and either you're breaking it down or you're having a model break it down to smaller things, and then you're putting that in a loop with verification on the other side of saying, okay, well, this is what, but particularly with something that's well defined, like, how a compiler should work or something like that. You can run these loops for a long period of time where it's going, okay, like, it's looking up after each sort of iteration going, all right, am I closer? How far am I through my task list? What's working? Here's my verification for what I'm just doing. Here's my verification for what we're doing overall. Like, you can have loops within loops. It's just, there's an interesting phenomenon where it's like you've almost got emergent software coming out, like almost like what we do as architects and engineers within organizations, but you've got this little microcosm of doing this with models.
I think there's one critique here, well, maybe more, but like the thing is, I'm not sure we know what we do and how we do it. I'm not sure like there's this kind of idea of the background. I think it was Wittgenstein who said the great hurly-burly or whatever. And so like we just look, all you could do is reflect on the fact that you could drive home from the shops or whatever and forgot. You couldn't even remember you've gone through 3 traffic lights. No idea, right? You just end up at home. You know, it's like there's this kind of background in our, somehow the human, whatever it is able to sort of, you know, the stuff we just don't even know. You know, all this context, you know, we call it context, but it's not really something you could imprint on something or describe to anyone. You know, it's just part of your background. And that's what I think, I mean, if you look at a really good, you know, developer who's been doing it for years, there's so much content. I mean, at the same time they're typing, they're probably thinking about, okay, is this the right place to put this thing? Should be in another service? Oh, what about didn't I talk to her over in the other domain? Weren't they doing, you know, that sort of stuff? You know, like you don't even know you're doing it, and you're doing it. And so as soon as you start making it concrete through a prompt or whatever it happens to be, that's a breakdown case. So you actually get out of your flow. I'm not saying the flow of typing. I'm saying the flow of whatever the hell being a human is, and having all this experience.
But what if you're putting that into your, your document-driven development? Because
no, you can't, because you don't know it. That's the point
of
the background.
You know some of it, right? Because you're having epiphanies. You're creating, and you could continue where you're from, or you can also rerun the whole lot. Like, you know, okay, well, actually, I know now where we go off the off the bend, off the corner, and so therefore I'm going to put some balustrades there and see what happens. I can rerun this 5 times, and it may produce software that fulfills the different needs that we're trying to optimize for.
I think you've got to shrink the problem space down as well, right? So I think also, small problem space, less variability, and then better outcomes. But also, the agentic workflow idea I think is super powerful. But for me, I've only found it's when it's something that has to be done many times, and so it might be, for example, creating some test data or mapping between 2 APIs, and you know that there's a whole bunch of work that you've got to do. So you can create a really nice little agentic workflow, and it's, you know, it might have a plan stage, and then it's got an act stage, and it's going to tell you what it's going to do before it actually does it. And then when you actually do it, then it's got a bunch of nice kind of deterministic steps, and you might even do some spec by example before so you know that you're going to get an answer you can check. And so then, that works incredibly well. But I think, and you are right, Col, in terms of you are pulling tacit knowledge out of your head and you are making it explicit. And I think for some people that's quite hard, to be honest.
But I think that's being human. The reason why it's hard is because we're human. I mean, I think like as you're saying, when you're sitting down here thinking, right, I'm going to write some spec, you know, like blah blah blah. That's in I guess in the whatever this human consciousness is, this state of being is basically a breakdown case. So we're in a situation where we go, right, I now need to take Occam's razor to this problem and do this, you know, these steps. You know, so there's sure, that makes entire sense. But it's actually the art of being human and doing the thing we're doing, in this case, having a huge amount of experience of, say, development. Those things are really hard to surface.
But then is that just not abstraction, right? So you can still stay in flow and still be the human with tacit knowledge, but now you've just taken this thing out that you had to think about, which was really low level, and you've made an agentic workflow that does it for you, and now you can just lift it up.
Yeah, I agree. Because again, that's that kind of like AI as a helper, you know. So basically, it's like an assistant.
I'm definitely describing it as we're still the operator there, but your ways of interjecting and guiding are different, or at least you're applying them at a different abstraction level. So in that way, it's sort of like, you know, it's a small gear turning the larger gear.
I mean, as an example, I mean, like I was reading some research recently, you know, around like where AI is going to sit with enterprise architecture, for instance, because of course it's going to revolutionize it, and things are going to be way better. But you know, it was like, well, you know, as the AI assistant to the EA, which means you can read all these documents, you can summarize, you know, all the stuff that you don't have to do anymore. You can become more real time. It's like, yeah, but the question is, why the hell are all these documents sitting there that no one reads?
You know, that's an interesting one, isn't it? It's like, so yes, you can do things that may or may not be valuable faster, but you
Yeah,
still
yeah.
can't. You still have to question the value, right? I think, yeah.
Oh, we've invented
totally.
something that will read those documents for us now, so all is saved.
All it's done is generated yet another thing, yet another artifact you've got to put somewhere, and and remember you had it, and then not read it. It's like, what is it? Write once, read never.
Yeah.
It's the history of architecture.
Well,
Yes.
Gareth, as a predictor, for normally at this point of the show, you're throwing to me and asking me to run through some notes and some summary of the conversation.
Yeah, you should do that.
I did not take those notes. We're going to use an AI model to summarize after the fact.
I was going to use Col.
Yeah, do you remember?
I'm not even sure what I said. What did we say? What were we talking about?
It was a fever dream.
All I remember is the Romans.
What have they ever done for us?
Well, yeah, bridges, of course, and the wine.
In architecture, apparently.
Yeah, LLM.
Yeah.
Well, look, we have covered a fair bit of ground. I think a brief whirlwind tour of some architectural styles from heavy frameworks and maybe not the abandonment, but the keeping the bits that are still relevant and leaving the other bits behind. Through some things that we've been surprised at evolving, like domain-driven design, which has led on through to data mesh, and then we talked about some of the different styles of data products and different sort of technologies that can underpin them. Talked about schemas and semantic data or semantic meaning, and how that can apply to different sort of data products as well. What else did we cover? A bit of philosophy.
Reflexivity. Yeah.
Yeah, reflexivity. Yeah, a bit of Foucault. You always got to get a bit of Foucault in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So no, it's a great session as always, Col. Thank you. That's probably a pretty good place to wrap up. And but always good to see you and to chat. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic. All right. See you soon.
See you, everybody.